purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage of modern games, their pros and their cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be of similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers, and even some veterans, can often find it a daunting and confusing place to be. This series hopes to lend a helping hand. In the early 1990s, the role-playing world was shaken up a little. Where most games of the 1970s and 1980s had relied on dice and character abilities to experience role-playing from an almost mechanistic perspective, and such games had become ever more complex, a shift would begin that would push role-playing along a more story-based route. A route where killing monsters would be very much take a back seat to the development and play of character personality. Drape this concept of storytelling focus through role-playing games, with the sensibilities of the goth movement emerging from the 1970s and 1980s, led by bands such as the Sisters of Mercy, the Fields of the Nephilim, the Mission, Bauhaus and more, and you end up with the subject of today's video essay, White Wolf's World of Darkness, and, in particular, Vampire the Masquerade. Our story begins in 1987, with a game company called Lion Rampart, and a game called Ars Magica. The game, authored by Jonathan Tweet, who went on to be a designer of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, and Mark Reinhagen, of whom we will speak more. Rather than use lots of cross-reference tables, levels, compound dice rolls and similar hallmarks of the role-playing games to that point, Ars Magica simplified things. Success or failure came from a simple modified die roll against a target set by difficulty. Modifiers were kept to a minimum. Abilities, split into talents, skills and knowledges, were finite and pertinent. Variance between characters was largely down to a player's selection of virtues and flaws for their own particular stable. All in all, game mechanics were kept to a simple minimum to enable the game's focus, the depiction of spellcasters in a semi-realistic milieu of the medieval world. Fast forward a few years to 1990, and Lion Rampart found itself in financial trouble. Salvation came in the form of a merger with the publishers of a role-playing and fiction magazine, White Wolf, named after Michael Moorcock's character Elric of Melniboné, who carried the nickname The White Wolf. With Reinhagen and Stuart Wick as co-owners, the merger formed White Wolf Game Studios, which was to become one of the most successful companies in the role-playing game market through the decade. During that year, Reinhagen arrived upon the concept of a game that reversed the traditional role-playing view of heroic characters battling monsters. Instead, the players would play the monsters, in the form of vampires. Building on different takes of vampires throughout mythology, he attempted to create a vampiric monomyth to tie these together within the scope of interesting game archetypes. This led to the idea of vampire clans. The brooding aristocratic vampire archetype became the Ventru, the monstrous creatures of the shadows became the Nosferatu, and so on. The backdrop of Ars Magica became linked via House Tremere, an order from Ars Magica that became a clan of magic-wielding vampires within the developing world of darkness. For the origin of vampires, Reinhagen leaned upon the works of Joseph Campbell and the concept of monomyth. Simply, monomyth examines a multitude of religions and mythologies and distills them into a single tapestry. Within Vampire, Reinhagen worked aspects of real-world mythologies into a backstory that explained the existence of vampires, and the way that vampires may have shaped the world from ancient times to the modern setting of the game. From the basis of the biblical Cain becoming the first vampire, following his murder of Abel and subsequent exile, human history is tracked within the game's lore, associating such things as the fall of Carthage, the rise and fall of Al-Andalus within the Iberian Peninsula, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Great Fire of London, and many others to the actions of vampires, or indirect consequence of their actions, or as a result of vampires acting against each other. It created a very potent mixture. The game was released in 1991 with good reviews and fairly rapid rise in popularity. By the end of the decade, in fact, Vampire the Masquerade would eclipse virtually every role-playing game system, except for the edifice that is Dungeons & Dragons. The game's rules were expanded by the Player's Guide, which introduced more types of vampires to play, new clans and minor groups known as bloodlines, and further with the Storyteller's Handbook in 1992. Note the switch in terminology from D&D's Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. With additional sourcebooks and scenarios describing the default setting of Chicago, and then reading beyond to Milwaukee and Mexico with further inserts in between. A World of Darkness in 1992 gave an overview of the global setting in summary. From 1993, with the release of Clanbook Bruja, the common trope of splatbook escalation made it into the World of Darkness lines, with every supernatural subtype eventually receiving its own book, or at least a portion of a shared splat, that explored high powers and delved into the subject's backstory. Vampire received a second edition in 1992 alongside the second World of Darkness game, Werewolf the Apocalypse. Werewolf would receive its second edition in 1994, following Mage the Ascension in 1993 and Wraith the Oblivion in 1994. The World of Darkness line continued to steadily release one game in the series per year. Changeling the Dreaming in 1995, Vampire the Dark Ages in 1996, Werewolf the Wild West in 1997, Kindred of the East in 1998, and Hunter the Reckoning in 1999. A gap year in 2000 was subsequently followed by Mummy the Resurrection in 2001 and Demon the Fallen in 2002. Orpheus was the final game in the line, released in 2003, which possessed a more focused, limited scope than the preceding games. White Wolf would often release books following a common theme across all of the World of Darkness game lines. These were the Year of the Hunter in 1995, which saw the release of those organisations antagonistic towards the beings of the core rulebooks. The Year of the Ally in 1997, with books describing such beings that aided them. 1998's Year of the Lotus saw the release of Kindred of the East, and several volumes describing the Eastern World of Darkness from the perspective of other games. The Year of Reckoning in 1999 saw the release of Hunter the Reckoning, and the end of the Wraith the Oblivion game line with Ends of Empire. 2000 was the Year of Revelations, which tied into many of the themes thus far only briefly touched on within the game lines. The Year of the Scarab in 2001 saw the release of Mummy the Resurrection, and a number of Near East supplements. Similarly, the Year of the Damned in 2002 was tied to the release of Demon the Fallen. An overarching theme of all of the World of Darkness games was the concept of a near and approaching end time. Throughout the vampire books, for example, the concept of Gehenna was explored, with the most ancient vampires would rise from their slumber to devour the vampires themselves. Each of the game lines had their own take on this end of days theme, and the final 2 years of the original World of Darkness run, 2003 and 2004, explored them all within the Time of Judgment themed releases. The whole series was wrapped up in 2004 in 4 volumes: Gehenna, Apocalypse, Ascension, and Time of Judgment. A 5th book, Laws of Judgment, was released for the live-action role-playing variant of the World of Darkness game, Mind's Eye Theatre. And that was it for a while. White Wolf went on to produce another series of games about supernatural beings with the Storytelling rather than the Storyteller game line, Vampire the Requiem, and so on. These games used some terms, notably clan names from the original games, and were certainly glossier in style, but for some reason they just didn't gel for me. In 2006, computer game publisher CCP Games bought White Wolf Publishing and continued to publish tabletop books, albeit on a smaller scale. through to 2011, at which point they ceased following the publication of the 20th anniversary edition of Vampire the Masquerade. This edition of the game compiled a lot of the information from the clan books, the player's guides and the storyteller's handbooks into a single volume. Rich Thomas, who was White Wolf's creative director, subsequently left CCP and founded Onyx Path Publishing. Onyx Path picked up the 20th anniversary edition and completed the set with similarly updated versions of Werewolf, Mage and Dark Ages and others, and continued to support those lines with further content. Lore of the Clans and Lore of the Bloodlines, for example, completes the compilation of clanbook material. White Wolf was sold yet again in 2015, this time to Paradox Interactive. Onyx Path were in the throes of creating their own 4th edition of Vampire the Masquerade, but Paradox caused that to halt. Instead, Paradox created their own edition under a 5th edition banner, which was released in 2018 with some controversy within its content. This was gradually cleared up with collaboration from Onyx Path and Modiphius Entertainment, and the current 5th edition has been somewhat toned down with respect to certain elements its original publication portrayed. The concept of 5th edition follows a post-Time of Judgment world, explaining how the events described in the 2003 to 2004 plotlines didn't bring about the end of vampires and all of the other supernaturals after all. Currently, there are numerous editions of the World of Darkness games in print via Drive-Thru RPG and a handful of publishers. The first, second and third, also known as revised editions of the original games, are available through the White Wolf imprint owned by Paradox. The 20th anniversary editions of those games are available through Onyx Path. 5th edition is available from Paradox and is additionally supported by Onyx Path. For those preferring the reboot, Vampire the Requiem and its related line are available through the White Wolf imprint. The basic mechanic of the Storyteller games is simple. Roll a number of 10-sided dice determined by aptitude against a target number determined by the difficulty of whatever was being attempted. Each die that equals or exceeds the target is counted as a success, and each that comes up as a 1 is counted as a botch. Botches eliminate successes, and the number of successes left produces a degree of success, from essentially a critical failure if only botches remain, to failure if no successes or botches remain, to increasing degrees of successful completion. Complications are added in that might require a certain number of successes to be scored before a task has been completed, which may take an extended period of time to accumulate, and tasks that are in opposition, resisted actions, in which case the number of successes scored by one participant over another becomes the key factor. In order to figure out how many dice a character uses, various characteristics are represented in terms of dots. Each dot is worth 1 dice when that characteristic is used. Characteristics are divided into 9 attributes: physical, social and mental base capabilities, abilities, mundane talents, skills and knowledges, supernatural powers, for example, disciplines for vampires, and background factors that cover base nature, resistance to giving in to the urges of their supernatural kind, and so on. This base system has the strange side effect of making a high aptitude character more likely to fumble a result than one with lesser ability, purely because in the latter case there is a lower chance of rolling multiple 1s. As a side note, this effect is actually recognised and used in Free League Publishing's Aliens role-playing game, as multiple dice are added to a player's pool, simultaneously increasing the chances of both success and catastrophe. In the Storyteller system, however, I don't believe this side effect was intentional. A character's dice pool can be split to perform multiple actions, a facet that is baked into the combat system. Combat is easy, using the basic system and adding multiple successes as bonus damage. Being supernatural creatures, player characters can also resist or soak damage, making them far harder to kill than mere mortals. Vampires themselves can also heal, as well as performing other supernatural abilities, by burning blood points. I think you may be able to take an educated guess with respect to how blood points may be renewed. Supernatural powers are measured in terms of dots, but these do not always equate to dice. For example, the vampiric discipline of potence refers to supernatural strength, and it adds 1 die to strength feats per dot. However, at a 6 and higher dots, it also imbues additional capabilities. On the other hand, thaumaturgy, representing magical study, is a discipline that is divided into many different paths of sorcery, with each dot in a path unlocking new powers to wield. The system as a whole is easy to reference and quick to use, which is great from a role-playing point of view. That is, the mechanics of the system do not get in the way of the player's portrayal of their characters, and neither does the game become a miniature skirmish when a fight breaks out. It's pretty much storytelling all the way. Away from the mechanics, the game has a role-playing scope like no other. The political and social hierarchy of the creatures examined by each game is baked in, which means that the players have distinct boundaries to work within. Inside those boundaries, there are many ways the game can go. The danger is in treating the game as if it's a traditional RPG, with a party of allies going out to seek adventure. This misses a lot of the point. To really make the game work, each character being played must be examined individually, and their position within the often mismatched group must be explained. This explanation may or may not be secret, or may have many layers of both secret and open natures. Players must derive motives for their characters and bring those motives through into play. The referee, storyteller in this game, can forge links to beings higher in the grand scheme of things and build agendas of those into the motives of the player characters. Even when playing through the published scenario, these dimensions and relationships are important, as they define the manner in which the characters and thus the players interact within their own group, which then has a bearing on how the group deals with external circumstance. The games were advertised with the tagline "Personal Horror," and that is something to examine. They are games of the horror genre, but rather playing plucky investigators futilely struggling against the uncaring powers of the void, the players are taking on the roles of the monsters in the darkness themselves. They should be encouraged to explore characters that frighten them. Another danger is in treating the game as a superhero one. The characters do wield great power right from the get-go. They should not be the focus of the game, however. In fact, background and mechanisms are written to actively discourage this. The Masquerade, for example, and its rules made to prevent vampires from triggering another Inquisition. All in all, the game is a solid one, and the books follow the pattern of all great role-playing works. They are more about setting the mood and the theme than in presenting gazillions of rules. All of the Storyteller games do their jobs well, with the pinnacle being reached with the revised, aka third editions, as these incorporated many of the refinements that were made into the base system as each game in the series was developed and released. The easiest of the games to get a handle on are Vampire and Werewolf, perhaps because we have an innate understanding of these creatures from their presence in myth and movie. Mage and Wraith are a bit harder to manage, for me at least. Mage the Ascension feels, I think purposely so, like an offshoot of Ars Magica, and the open magic system may not be to everyone's taste, particularly those who have cut their magic teeth on games that use a more defined system of spells, such as RuneQuest, Dungeons & Dragons and Rollmaster. Wraith's concepts of Ascent, Oblivion, and the spirit world of the World of Darkness may have contributed it to being the least commercially successful of the series of games. However, it does possess one of the most intriguing mechanics in any of them, that of the Shadow, a secondary persona played by another player. Each player had their own Wraith character, plus a Shadow character associated with another player's character. The Shadow represented that part of the Wraith's inner turmoil that sought out ultimate destruction. Changeling the Dreaming is, I think, the odd one out amongst the whole set. Yes, it deals with supernatural beings, and yes, some of the themes examined can be fairly horrific. But with a broad brush, both in the game's writing and in its artwork, it came across to me as far too whimsical. The games, because they use the same basic system, can be mixed and matched. This is easier in some cases than in others, but is generally not difficult to do. The hardest part is in making the scope of a mixed group work without things becoming too messy to make sense. All in all, Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf the Apocalypse remain among my favourite games. Wraith the Oblivion not so much, but with the caveat that I think the shadow concept is one of my favourite mechanics that I've ever seen in a game. Mage the Ascension I found difficult to get into, but its Renaissance version, the Sorcerer's Crusade, did catch me more. Perhaps because the modern theme seems to jar against what I was recognising in its pages as an Ars Magica offshoot, while the Sorcerer's Crusade seemed to marry better with that. I imagine someone not already familiar with Ars Magica may have an easier time with Mage. Hunter the Reckoning I can take or leave. The core concept was that certain humans were beginning to awaken closer to the end times with supernatural powers themselves, able to fight back against the creatures of the night. Weirdly, Demon Hunter X, a supplement ostensibly set within the Kindred of the East subsetting, I found more to my taste, and even drew parallels with that and David Mack's Kabuki comics within my own games. I've already mentioned Changeling the Dreaming and how I felt that themes were a jarring departure from those generally portrayed within the world of darkness. Demon the Fallen began as an interesting game, and I enjoyed the core rulebook, but there was something missing within the later materials for it. Whether this was because the Storyteller system was coming to a close, or whether the scope of the game that I'd grasped through the core rulebook was not the same as the one envisaged by the developers. For me, Mummy the Resurrection is the most pointless of the games. An earlier supplement, simply titled Mummy, had already explored these beings, and the game did little except to shoehorn them into a full Storyteller game format. It is also the smallest in page count of the core game rules. I suspect it was an afterthought more than a truly considered game. I never did get into Orpheus. It did not fit with the vampire games that we were playing, and by the time it was coming out, we had already seen the writing on the wall for the Storyteller line. Why buy another game in a line that had, however subtly, already been advertised as coming to an end? My main negative across all of the game lines is in the sheer volume of splat books. During the initial couple of years, and indeed the final few leading up to 2004, this wasn't such a problem. But during the interim period, it did get ridiculous. Every clan, tribe, order, guild, kith, and so on got its own splat book, often multiple times, and often across multiple instances of the games. In some ways, this ruined the experience for me, with constant revisions and revelations becoming exhausting for a storyteller to keep up with and to incorporate. As it was, I largely ignored them, picking those bits I liked from them and discarding the revisionist perspective. The 20th anniversary editions, with their compilations of the splatbook material, were a welcome creation, and in fact, the compilation of these materials so that they work together is an even more welcome construct. But overall, regardless of what I think about individual games or books and their usefulness to play, there is one underlying positive. The White Wolf authors had exemplary writing skills. Whether I liked a particular game or not, used a particular book or not, I always enjoyed reading them. For any of the original World of Darkness games, the core 20th anniversary editions are the only essentials. Every one of these gives you more than enough material to play that particular game. To these, though, I would add a handful of expansion books. For Vampire, I'd add Lore of the Clans and Lore of the Bloodlines. For Werewolf, I'd add Changing Breeds. For Vampire 5th edition, the core rulebook has all you need. 3 more editions I would go for, if heading down the Vampire line. The Book of Nod, the Book of the Kindred, and the Encyclopedia Vampirica. These make for good in and out of game reference works that are great for a storyteller to plumb. The world of darkness in general is a great concept, and the Storyteller system is light enough for that concept to be explored in great depth by players wishing to experience their own personal horror. White Wolf produced a series of non-traditional role-playing games that set the stage for more story-driven role-playing games that we see today. And that has been my review of Vampire the Masquerade, and briefly touching on the other games in the Storyteller system. If you want to find out more about these games, then links are in the description to the various sites and publishers' websites that you can go and have a look on. And make of it what you will. So thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all of that kind of stuff if you enjoyed this rambling scope of mine. And I'll see you in the next video.